15 years. That's how long Lena Ashcroft lived as a debtor. Not because she borrowed the money, but because people said her father did. 15 years of sacrificing meals, sleep, and even the smallest dreams to pay off a debt that never ends. And today, she walked into the office of the city's most powerful crime boss with the last envelope of money in her hand. Surely this was the day she would be free. But the man behind the desk just looked at her, gently pushed the envelope back, and uttered 3 words that shattered her entire life. That debt doesn't exist. If you want to know what truth has been hidden for those 15 years, like this post, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has progressed, and follow along to the end, because from here, things will never be as you think. The envelope was thin. That was the first thing Lena noticed when she pulled it from her coat pocket and set it on the edge of the desk. How thin it was for something that had taken 15 years to fill. She had counted the money 4 times that morning. $43,800. Every cent she owed, according to the ledger her mother had kept folded inside a Bible that nobody in the family ever opened anymore. The numbers were her mother's handwriting, careful and small, and her mother had died keeping those numbers, never once questioning whether they were real. Lena had never questioned them either. Not until now, standing in the 43rd floor of the Voss Tower with the skyline burning orange behind floor-to-ceiling glass, and a man she had never met looking at her the way a doctor looks at a patient who doesn't yet know the diagnosis. Damien Voss was not what she expected. She had built him in her mind over 15 years, something sharp-edged and cold, something with the posture of a man who collects suffering the way other men collect vintage cars. What she found instead was someone who sat with the quiet economy of a person accustomed to rooms going silent when he entered them. Mid-40s, maybe. Dark suit, no tie. A scar along his left jawline that someone had once tried to stitch cleanly and failed. He hadn't looked up when she came in. He was reading a file, and he finished reading it before he acknowledged her presence, which told her everything about the power dynamic before either of them spoke a word. "Lena Ashcroft," he said. Not a question. That's right. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She had practiced this. The posture of someone who isn't afraid, even when the body knows better. "I'm here to close out the account." He looked at the envelope, then at her. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, more like recognition, the way you recognize a specific kind of stubbornness because you've worn it yourself. He leaned back in his chair and studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Suit yourself." She pushed the envelope toward him across the desk. It slid 3 inches and stopped. Neither of them touched it. $43,800, she said. "Principal plus interest through this month. I have the calculation breakdown if you need it." "I don't." "Then we're done." "We're not." The 2 words landed without heat, which made them worse. She had prepared for anger, for negotiation, for some performance of dominance that she could push back against. She had not prepared for this, for the quiet that followed, for the way Damien Voss looked at the envelope, the way you look at something that belongs to a different version of a story you've already read. He picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, set it back down on her side of the desk. "Take it." Lena didn't move. "I said take it." "I heard you." Her voice was steadier than her pulse. "I'm not leaving without a receipt." "There's no receipt to give." He opened the drawer on his right side and removed a black folder. Thick. The kind of thickness that comes not from padding, but from paper. From many, many pages of paper. He set it on the desk between them and kept his hand flat on top of it. The debt was cleared. 7 years ago. The room did something strange. The air changed pressure without moving. "That's not possible," Lena said. "Open it." She looked at the folder, then at him. His expression hadn't changed. He wasn't performing anything, not menace, not generosity, not guilt. He was watching her the way someone watches a fuse after they've lit it, knowing the burn is already happening and there's nothing left to do but wait. She reached across and opened the folder. The first page was a loan document, her father's name at the top, Thomas Ashcroft, and below it, a signature she would have recognized anywhere. She had grown up watching him sign things, birthday cards, permission slips, the back of her school photographs. This was his signature, his full cursive T followed by the sharp downstroke of the H, exactly as she remembered it. But the account number on the document didn't match any account she had ever seen in her parents' financial records. She turned the page. The second document was a bank transfer confirmation. $50,000 moved from an account registered to Thomas Ashcroft into an operating account belonging to a holding company called Meridian Capital Partners. The date on the transfer was 6 weeks before his death. She had never heard of Meridian Capital Partners. She turned the page again. What she found on the third page made her hand stop. It was a surveillance photograph, black and white, taken from a distance, the grain of it suggesting the photographer had been at least 200 meters away. Her father was standing outside what looked like a federal building, briefcase in hand, talking to a man in a dark overcoat whose face was angled away from the camera. The timestamp in the corner read 18 months before Thomas Ashcroft was reported dead. Lena looked up. "Where did you get these?" "I've had them for 12 years, Damien said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you right now." She looked back at the folder. There were at least 40 more pages. She could see the edges of more photographs, more documents, what appeared to be spreadsheet printouts, dense with numbers and account codes. "My father," she started, "was not a borrower." Damien's voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but more deliberate, the way a man speaks when he is choosing every word with the care of someone who has rehearsed this conversation 100 times and still doesn't trust himself to get it right. He owed nothing to this organization. He never did. The floor felt wrong under her feet. Solid, obviously solid, 43 floors of steel and concrete, but something in her internal architecture had shifted and the ground wasn't reading the way it should. Then what was the debt my mother paid for 12 years? Her voice came out quieter than she intended. What were the letters? The collectors? Sit down, Lena. This time she did. She sat in the chair across from him and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and looked at the man who had just told her that her entire adult life had been organized around a lie, and she waited for him to explain it, and she did not let herself cry because she had not cried since her father's funeral, and she was not going to start now, not here, not in front of him. Damien poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on the credenza behind him, set one in front of her, kept the other. "Your father," he said, "was a forensic accountant with the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Bureau for 11 years, specialized in tracing hidden capital flows through shell corporations and offshore banking networks. He was very good at it, one of the best they had, by most accounts." She knew this. She had known this. It was one of the few things from her childhood that felt solid. Her father at his desk, surrounded by ledgers and yellow legal pads covered in numbers, explaining to her once that every dollar leaves a shadow, and if you know how to read shadows, you can find anything. 3 years before he died, Damien continued, he opened an investigation into a network that moved money through 12 countries. The network had fingers in port logistics, private banking, mid-level political finance, and organized crime distribution in 6 American cities. The investigation had a working title internally. They called it Operation Meridian, the holding company name on the transfer document. Lena felt the connection land in her stomach before her mind had finished processing it. "Someone inside the bureau was feeding information to the network," Damien said. "Your father figured out who. He compiled the evidence. He was 3 days from filing it through official channels when he disappeared." "He died," Lena said. Her voice was flat, automatic. The correction of someone who has said those words so many times they've stopped carrying weight. Damien looked at her, said nothing. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. "He died," she said again, but this time it came out differently. Less certain, more a question aimed at herself. "The debt collection your mother received was not a real debt," Damien said, moving forward before she could fracture entirely. "It was a leash. Someone needed to make sure that if Thomas Ashcroft had shared anything with his family, names, documents, access codes, the family would stay too frightened and too financially depleted to do anything about it. The collectors were monitoring your household, Lena. Every visit, every ledger entry your mother made. They were watching to see if you knew anything." The water glass was in front of her and she picked it up because she needed something to do with her hands. The glass was cold, real. She focused on that. "And you?" she said. Where do you come in? It wasn't a question the way she said it. It was an accusation wearing the shape of a question. Something shifted in Damien's posture. Not defensiveness, something closer to discomfort, which she suspected was a sensation he had very limited experience with. Your father and I crossed paths during an investigation in 2009. He was looking into a money laundering channel that ran partially through an organization I controlled at that time. He said it without flinching, which she gave him minimal credit for. He could have moved against me. He had enough. He chose instead to make a deal. He would pull my operation out of the evidence file if I gave him documentation on the larger network, the one above me. He protected you. He used me. There's a difference, and he was smart enough to know it. A beat. I gave him what he asked for. 3 months later, he was gone and the network was still operating, and I had a folder full of documents I didn't know what to do with. So you kept them. I kept them. For 12 years. Yes. Lena set the glass down carefully. Why? Damien's jaw tightened, just slightly. The scar along it went pale. Because he kept his word, he said, and because he had a daughter. She didn't say anything to that. There was nothing to say to that. She looked out through the glass at the city spread below them, all of it ordinary and moving and completely indifferent to the fact that 15 years of her life had just been restructured without her consent. And she thought about her mother's careful handwriting, all those numbers in the margins of a book nobody ever opened, and she pressed her teeth together until the pressure in her jaw matched the pressure behind her eyes. What happens now? She said. That depends on what you want. I want to know what really happened to my father. Damien opened the folder again and turned to a page near the back. He rotated it so she could read it. It was a photograph, sharper than the others, more recent, the color off in the way that surveillance imagery often went off under artificial light. It showed a man in a gray jumpsuit seated at a metal table in what appeared to be an institutional room. The man was older than she remembered, thinner. His hair had gone entirely white. He had a scar along his right temple, and his hands on the table were folded with the careful stillness of someone who had learned to keep still over a very long time. But she knew his hands. She had held them when she was 7 years old, and her nightmares had been the ordinary kind. Monsters under beds, darkness behind doors. She had held them again at her mother's funeral, except that time they hadn't been there, and she had held only empty air and a folded program with a photograph that didn't look quite right. She knew his hands. That was taken 4 months ago, Damien said. The facility is private. It belongs to a corporate holding structure that traces back to the same network your father was investigating. Lena looked at the photograph for a long time. He's alive, she said. Yes. They've had him for 12 years. They need him. He created the encryption architecture on the financial ledgers he was building the case from. The access codes exist only in his memory. As long as they haven't gotten them out of him, the full scope of the network stays hidden. She was aware of her breathing now in a way she normally wasn't. The inhale felt too short. The exhale didn't clear anything. How do you know they haven't gotten the codes? Because the network is still operating carefully. If they had what they needed from him, they'd have moved the assets and gone dark years ago. They're still exposed, which means he's still holding. She thought about her father at his desk, surrounded by his ledgers, explaining shadows to a 10-year-old who didn't fully understand. She thought about the quality of patience that required, not just holding under pressure, but holding for 12 years, in a room with no windows, with no reason to believe anyone was coming. She looked up from the photograph. I need everything in that folder, she said. I know. And I need to know where the facility is. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There are people who've been watching this office since you walked in. Not mine. The words reached her a half-second before she understood what they meant. When she did, she stood up from the chair without thinking, the body moving before the decision was fully processed, the old instinct for exits kicking in. Damien was already on his feet, the phone at his ear, speaking low and fast to someone whose voice she couldn't hear. She looked toward the door, looked back at him. How long? She said. Long enough. He lowered the phone, looked at her with the directness of someone who has run out of time for anything but truth. There's a stairwell behind the north wall panel. It takes you to a service corridor on 38. Someone will be waiting. Do not stop for anything. You're coming. I'm right behind you. He picked up the black folder and held it out to her. Don't let go of this. She took it. The weight of it in her hands felt enormous, the way things feel when you suddenly understand what they cost. Outside the window, the city continued its ordinary motion. Traffic and light and people with lives that had no idea that somewhere below them, a woman was holding 12 years of buried truth in her arms and trying to remember how to breathe while a man she didn't trust told her to run. She ran. The stairwell smelled like concrete dust and old electrical wiring, and the specific kind of dark that exists in places where light was never the priority. Lena took the stairs 2 at a time, with the folder pressed hard against her chest, her free hand dragging along the railing for orientation because the emergency lighting was doing the minimum it was legally required to do and not a single lumen more. Behind her, she could hear Damien. His footsteps were different from hers, more controlled, the kind of footfall that comes from years of moving through spaces where noise is a liability. He wasn't running. He was moving fast, but there was a quality to it that wasn't panic, and she hated him slightly for that because she was absolutely panicking and she needed to be the only one. 5 flights. Then a door marked maintenance. No entry in faded red letters that someone had tried to scratch off and only partially succeeded. Damien reached past her and pushed it open with his shoulder. The corridor beyond was narrow and fluorescent lit and smelled like solvent and dry heat from the building's ventilation infrastructure. Pipes ran along the ceiling. The floor was bare concrete, scuffed and stained. At the far end, maybe 60 feet away, a man was standing with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, and the posture of someone who has been told to wait and does not enjoy waiting. He was large, not gym large, functionally large, the kind of size that comes from doing things with your body rather than performing things with it. He had a shaved head and a jacket that fit wrong across the left shoulder in the way that jackets fit wrong when there's something underneath them. Marcus, Damien said. We've got a vehicle issue, Marcus said. They flagged the garage exit. There's 2 of them on the street level. How long ago? 6 minutes. Rennie's watching them. Damien turned to Lena. Give me the folder. No. His jaw tightened. I'm not taking it. I need to know which documents you've looked at. I've looked at all of them. You've looked at the first 3 pages. She didn't answer because he was right, and they both knew it. The transfer documents in the back, he said. Pages 31 through 38. Don't look at them here. Don't look at them anywhere until I tell you it's safe. Do you understand? I don't take instructions from Lena. He said her name the way you say something you've been holding in your mouth too long. I know you have no reason to trust me. I know what I am, and I know what my organization is, and I know that nothing about this situation gives you a rational basis for following my lead. But there are 2 men standing outside this building right now who are not police and are not federal agents, and if they get their hands on that folder, your father dies inside that facility within 48 hours. So I need you to make a decision. She looked at him, at Marcus, at the folder in her arms. Where are we going? She said. Somewhere they're not. It wasn't good enough. She knew it wasn't good enough. She went anyway. Marcus led them through the maintenance corridor to a freight elevator that opened into the building's loading dock, a concrete bay at street level, half a floor below grade, where a white panel van was idling with its rear doors open and a second man in the driver's seat who didn't turn around when they climbed in. The doors closed. The van moved. Lena sat on the bare metal floor of the cargo area with the folder in her lap and her back against the van's side wall, and watched Damien sit across from her with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely folded and his eyes on the floor between them. Marcus rode up front. Nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes. The city moved past in fragments through the small rear windows. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary and different machinery of a weekday afternoon. Who were they? Lena said. People who've been watching me watch your situation for about 3 months. You've been watching my situation. Yes. Why? Because I knew this day was coming. He looked up. You've been making the final payments. I've had someone tracking the account activity. When the balance got close to 0, I knew you'd come in person. You're that kind of person. She filed that away. The implication that he knew what kind of person she was which meant he had spent time figuring it out. She didn't know what to do with that yet, so she left it. The men outside, she said. They work for the syndicate, a subcontractor layer. The network doesn't use direct employees for surveillance. It's cleaner. If those men get picked up, there's no connection that traces back. But you're connected. I was connected. 12 years ago, on the outer edge of a distribution network that has since restructured itself 4 times. My connection to Operation Meridian is circumstantial and predates the current structure. They watch me because I was adjacent to the investigation, not because they can prove anything. But they know about the folder. The van made a turn and the light shifted. They know something exists, Damien said carefully. They don't know what I have or how complete it is. If they did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. She thought about that. Thought about the word we. I need to call someone, she said. No. I have a contact at the bureau, someone who knew my father. If I can get this documentation to... No. His voice didn't rise. It went in the other direction, which was somehow more final. The bureau has a leak. Your father knew who it was. Whatever he compiled before he disappeared, one of the documents in that folder names the source. If you call anyone at the bureau without knowing which side they're on, you've told the network exactly where to look. Lena stared at him. You've read the folder, she said, several times. You know who the leak is? A pause. Fractional. She caught it. I have a strong theory, he said. That's not... If I tell you the name right now, your next move is to pick up a phone and call someone to verify it. And I've just explained why that's not something you can do safely. So the name stays with me until we have a controlled way to use it. She wanted to throw something at him. The folder was the only thing available, and she needed the folder, so she pressed her palms flat against it instead and breathed through her nose and looked at the ceiling of the van, which was bare metal with 2 mounting brackets that had once held something and now held nothing. You've been sitting on evidence that could have freed my father for 12 years, she said. The sentence came out very quiet. That quietness was not peace. 12 years, my mother died 3 years ago. She died believing... She stopped. Damien didn't try to fill the silence. That was the right call, which annoyed her. She died believing my father was a criminal and a coward who borrowed money and then abandoned his family. Her voice had steadied into something past emotion, into the register of pure factual accounting. She paid that debt every month until the last 6 months of her life, when she physically couldn't anymore and I took over. She died apologizing for him. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes. And you had... I had documentation that wasn't safe to surface. Something moved behind his eyes. The network was active. Anyone I went to could have been compromised. I spent 3 years trying to find a federal contact I could trust, and every option I identified either turned up dead or turned up dirty. So I kept the file and I waited and I watched. You waited, she said. Yes. For what exactly? For someone with enough reason to move and nothing left to lose. He looked at her directly. For you. The van stopped. Marcus opened the rear doors from outside and the light that came in was different. Dimmer, more orange. The light of a neighborhood that had been commercial once and was now something in between. They were in an alley behind what appeared to be a dry cleaning business, the kind of building that exists in every city in the world without anyone ever really looking at it. Inside, through a back entrance that had 3 separate locks, and none of them electronic, was a room that had been turned into something between a safe house and a working space. 2 folding tables pushed together, covered in laptops and printed documents and city maps with handwritten notations. A mini fridge in the corner. 2 cots against the far wall, both clearly slept in within the last few days. Blackout curtains on the windows, the adhesive-backed kind. A woman was sitting at the main table. She was maybe 35, Southeast Asian, wearing a canvas jacket with the sleeves pushed up. She was looking at a monitor with the focused absence of someone whose attention is entirely inside the screen. When they came in, she looked up, and the look she gave Lena was comprehensive and completely without warmth. This her, she said. Lena Ashcroft, Damien said. Nadia. Nadia's gaze moved to the folder, then back to Lena's face. Does she know about the codes? We were getting there. Getting there, Nadia repeated with the specific flatness of someone who has learned to express skepticism through intonation alone. She stood up. She was shorter than Lena expected, which made the density of her stillness more noticeable. The network has 3 new IP scans running against the financial routing tables your father built. They've been trying to brute force the access architecture for about 6 weeks. They're not close, but they're not giving up either. What does that mean? Lena said. It means they're getting impatient with whatever method they've been using to extract the codes from your father directly, and they're shifting to a technical approach. Nadia turned back to her monitor. Which means your father's value to them as a living prisoner is about to become negotiable. The sentence landed in the room with the weight of a physical object. How negotiable? Lena said. If they crack the encryption architecture independently, they don't need him anymore. Nadia pulled up something on the screen. A network diagram, layered and complex, nodes and pathways rendered in thin white lines against black. Our technical read gives them between 3 and 8 weeks before they get close enough that eliminating him becomes the cleaner option. 3 weeks. At the low end. Lena set the folder on the table, opened it to the photograph of her father, stood and looked at it for a moment with both hands flat on the table and her weight forward and the particular feeling of someone who has just been handed a deadline they didn't know existed. Where's the facility? She said. Pennsylvania. Damien came to stand beside her. Not close. Adjacent, the way 2 people stand when they're looking at the same problem from the same direction. Former pharmaceutical research campus. Privately purchased 9 years ago through a shell acquisition. On paper, it's a data security consultancy. How many people inside? Minimum security footprint publicly. 8 to 12 personnel on any given shift based on our surveillance. Internally, he glanced at Nadia. We don't have clean internal numbers, Nadia said without looking up. The facility runs dark, limited electronic signature. They know what they're doing. Lena looked at the network diagram on the screen, looked at the map on the table that had the facility circled in red pen. You've been planning this, she said to Damien, before I walked in today. I've been preparing for the possibility. How long? A pause. About 18 months. She turned and looked at him. You were waiting for me to finish paying off a debt that didn't exist, she said, so that I would come to you. Yes. You could have come to me. And told you what? Your father is alive and I've been protecting evidence of it and I need your help? He said it evenly. You would have gone to the bureau inside 24 hours. You would have trusted the wrong person. Your father would be dead and the evidence would be burned. So instead you watched my mother die and let me spend. There was no safe move. His voice cracked the smallest amount, a fracture so minor she almost missed it. There was no version of this where someone didn't pay a price they shouldn't have had to pay. I know that. I've known it for 12 years. I live with it the same way I live with everything else I've done, which is not well and not cleanly. But the file is intact, your father is alive, and we are here. That's what we have. Lena looked at him for a long time. She thought about her mother's careful numbers. She thought about 15 years of Sundays she had worked when she could have rested. She thought about the college program she had deferred and eventually abandoned, about the apartment she had never upgraded, about every version of a future she had set aside because there was always the debt. She picked up the folder, opened it to pages 31 through 38, the ones he had told her not to read. Damien didn't stop her. The documents on those pages were transfer records, different from the fabricated ones near the front. These were real, and she could see immediately why they were real, because the formatting was different. The account codes were formatted for internal government use, and the figures running through them were not the kind of numbers that showed up in personal banking. The last page in the sequence was a single sheet, a name at the top, a title below it, and beneath that a transaction history that tied a senior official at the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Bureau to 17 transfers across a 6-year period, totaling somewhere north of $4 million, routed through 3 of the same shell companies that appeared in her father's original investigation file. She knew the name. She had called that office after her father died when she was 22 and still believed that bureaucratic channels could answer bureaucratic questions. She had called and spoken to a man with a careful voice who had told her that her father's death had been investigated thoroughly and the findings were not subject to public disclosure. And she had hung up the phone and cried and then gotten on with the business of surviving. She had spoken to the leak. She had called him, and he had spoken to her, and somewhere in a facility in Pennsylvania, her father had been alive, and this man had known. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her. She had thought they would shake. "Gerald Hartman," she said. Damien said nothing. "He's still at the bureau," she said. "Deputy director," Damien said. "Promoted 18 months ago." She closed the folder. She understood now why he hadn't wanted her to see the name until she was in a room without a telephone and without a clear exit. Not because he was controlling her, because he understood exactly what this information would do to a person, and he needed her functional. She was going to need to stay functional. "What do you need from me?" she said. Nadia looked up from the monitor for the first time since Lena had opened the folder. Damien said, "Your father built the access architecture. The encryption codes are based on a personal key structure, something only he would know. We can get into the facility, we can get to him. But the evidence he's been protecting needs to be extracted and transmitted to the right people before we move, or the whole operation burns the moment the network realizes what's happening." "Who are the right people?" Lena said. "That's the part we haven't solved," Nadia said flatly. Lena looked at the map, at the red circle in Pennsylvania, at the lines Nadia had drawn connecting the facility to 3 other locations that she hadn't explained yet. "Give me 24 hours with the documents," Lena said. "We don't— 24 hours. She picked up the folder and held it. "My father was a forensic accountant. I grew up watching him work. I know how he built cases. If the access architecture is personal, I might be able to tell you what the key structure is based on." She looked at Damien. "Which means you need me for more than a reason to act. You need me to actually open the door." The room was quiet. Nadia looked at Damien. Damien looked at Lena with the expression of a man who has been operating this plan for 18 months and has just arrived at the part where the plan requires him to trust somebody. Outside the building, somewhere on the street beyond the blackout curtains, a car alarm started and then stopped. The city doing its ordinary thing, indifferent as ever. Then Damien's phone vibrated on the table. He looked at it. Something in his face changed. He turned the phone so Lena could see the screen. It was a text message from a number with no name attached, 4 words and a photograph. The 4 words were, "They moved him last night." The photograph was of the facility in Pennsylvania, or what had been the facility in Pennsylvania. The building in the image was dark, the windows vacant, the parking lot empty. Whoever had been inside it was gone. 3 weeks had just become— That was the thought that completed itself in Lena's mind while she stared at the photograph on Damien's phone. 3 weeks had just become 0. The facility was empty. Her father was gone. Whatever countdown Nadia had calculated against the network's technical approach had been rendered irrelevant by the simplest possible move. They had picked up the board and walked away with it. She became aware that she was still holding the folder. She set it down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something breakable after you've already dropped everything else. "When?" Damien said. He was looking at Marcus. "Message timestamp is 40 minutes ago," Marcus said. "Source is Rennie. He drove past the Pennsylvania site on the way back from the wire pickup." "Rennie's reliable?" 9 years, yeah. Damien looked at Nadia. Nadia was already typing, both hands moving across the keyboard with the focused violence of someone doing 3 things at once. "Pulling satellite archive on the site. If they moved him last night, I should be able to see vehicle traffic in the access road footage from the commercial imaging database." She paused. "Give me 8 minutes." 8 minutes was a long time to stand in a room with a folder full of evidence and a plan that had just lost its primary objective. Lena pulled out the chair in front of the map table and sat down in it because her legs had decided they were done performing competence for the moment. She put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands, and she stayed there for approximately 4 seconds, which was as long as she could afford. Then she took her hands away from her face and looked at the map. "Secondary sites," she said. "The 3 locations Nadia marked." Damien came to stand at the table. He pointed to the first mark, a dot on the New Jersey shoreline. "Port Logistics Hub. Network uses it for physical asset movement. Your father wouldn't be held there, too much civilian traffic." He moved his finger to the second mark, somewhere in Western Virginia, rural. "Former mining survey station, privately purchased. More consistent with a detention setup, but our intelligence on it is 8 months old." "And the third?" He didn't answer immediately. She looked up at him. The third mark was in upstate New York. A small square symbol, the kind you use on a map when you don't have a better notation system. It was located outside a town whose name she didn't recognize, and whoever had drawn the mark had pressed hard enough with the pen that it had slightly indented the paper. That one I'm less certain about, Damien said. Less certain is different from uncertain. There's a property up there registered to a subsidiary of one of the Meridian holding companies. We identified it 14 months ago. It's not a research campus, it's residential, estate property, large enough for staff quarters and containment infrastructure, but built to look like a private retreat. That's where they took him, Lena said. I don't know that. That's where they took him, she said again. Not louder, more settled. The way certain becomes a different quality than confidence, something you feel in your structure rather than your reasoning. If they were spooked enough to move him overnight, they went somewhere they trust, somewhere small, somewhere that doesn't look like what it is. She looked at the mark. That's the one, Nadia said from across the room. Got the satellite archive. They moved to her monitor. The image on screen was top down, the resolution good enough to read the contours of the Pennsylvania facility's parking area and access road. Nadia ran the playback, timestamp in the corner, cycling backward through last night's hours. At 2:47 a.m., 3 vehicles appeared at the facility's rear entrance. A panel van and 2 SUVs moving with the organized efficiency of a pre-planned operation. The vehicles were at the facility for 19 minutes. Then they left, heading north on the access road, and the timestamp continued to cycle, and the lot stayed empty and the building stayed dark. North, Marcus said. Upstate New York is north, Lena said. Nobody argued with her. Damien straightened up from the monitor. His jaw was working slightly, the scar on it catching the light from the screen. She had started to read him well enough in the past 2 hours to understand that this particular expression meant he was running calculations. Not mathematical ones, but the kind that involve people and trust and the specific arithmetic of what you're willing to lose. I need to make calls, he said. How many people do you need? Lena asked. For the estate property? If the security footprint is what I think it is. How many? 8 minimum, 12 preferred. How long to pull them together? 6 hours, maybe 5. We don't have 5 hours. She pointed at the satellite image. They moved him at 3 this morning. That's deliberate timing. Maximum distance covered before daylight. By now they're already at wherever they're going, and they're resettling him into a new setup. Every hour we wait is another hour for them to fortify the position. Rushing this gets people killed, Damien said. Not rushing, it gets my father killed, she said. And you've already lost 12 years waiting for the right moment. The room went still in a specific way. Damien looked at her. There was something in the look that wasn't anger, wasn't concession. It was more like the expression of a man who has just been handed an accurate mirror and doesn't especially enjoy what he sees in it. He picked up his phone. He stepped into the far corner of the room and began making calls. Lena turned back to the map and began studying the upstate property notation, pulling what she could from the surrounding geography. The nearest highway access, the topography suggested by the road lines, whether the property would have natural sight lines or natural cover. She became aware after a moment that Nadia was watching her. You've never done anything like this, Nadia said. It wasn't a judgment, it was observational, the way a mechanic says a part is worn without feeling anything about it. No. You should be terrified. I am. You're not showing it. I know. Lena didn't look up from the map. It goes somewhere else when I need it to. I don't know where. It's been doing that my whole life. Nadia was quiet for a moment, then, the folder. The access codes your father built the encryption around. Do you actually think you can figure out the key structure? I think I have a better chance than anyone else in this room. Based on what? Based on knowing him. She finally looked up. He built everything around things he loved. His methodology, his notation systems, the way he organized his work. When I was a kid, I used to go through his files because I thought it was like a puzzle. He built the same way every time. Layers, but they always started from something personal, something that mattered to him. She paused. He would have used something about our family, Something only I would recognize. Nadia studied her. That's either very useful or completely wrong, she said. I know. Damien came back from the corner. I can have 7 people by 3 this afternoon. 8th is a maybe. 7 is enough, Marcus said. 7 is not enough if the security inside is heavier than our read on it. Then we go in smart and we don't need numbers, Marcus said. He had the ease of someone who has had this specific disagreement many times and has resolved it in his own favor often enough to stop being anxious about it. Damien looked at Lena. I need you to understand something before we go any further. If we move on that property and your father isn't there, we've burned our operational cover and the network knows we're coming. There's no second attempt. He's there, she said. I need more than your instinct. Then give me an hour with the folder, she said. Let me cross-reference the holding company structure against the satellite geography of the upstate property. If the same shell architecture that ran the Pennsylvania facility owns or controls property in that county, we have documentary confirmation rather than instinct. Damien looked at Nadia. Nadia was already pulling up a corporate registry database. Give me the subsidiary names from pages 40 through 44, she said to Lena. They worked. Lena read the subsidiary names aloud from the folder, while Nadia ran them through the registry, tracing ownership chains through 3 and 4 layers of corporate structure with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this specific kind of unraveling many times. Marcus and Damien worked the phones. The safe house had the specific atmosphere of a place where tension has been living long enough to become furniture. It wasn't acute anymore, just present, like the hum of the ventilation system or the orange light coming around the edge of the blackout curtains. 47 minutes into it, Nadia said, There. She turned the monitor. The ownership chain was 7 entities deep. At the bottom, a Property Management LLC registered in Delaware with a forwarding address in Wilmington. At the top, after 6 intermediate layers, an offshore investment structure incorporated in the Cayman Islands that appeared in the Meridian Network documentation in Lena's folder on page 37. The property managed by the LLC at the bottom of the chain, 847 acres in Ulster County, New York, assessed as a private residential estate. That's confirmation, Lena said. Damien looked at the screen for a long moment, then at the map, then at something that wasn't in the room, some internal calculation completing itself behind his eyes. All right, he said. He started making different calls, the kind where he didn't explain the background, just gave coordinates and timing and the clipped logistical language of people who have agreed in advance to show up wherever they're pointed. Lena listened to the shape of it without understanding the specifics and thought about what her life had looked like 72 hours ago, which was ordinary in a way that now seemed almost incomprehensible. Alarm clock. Coffee. The commute to the accounting firm where she had worked for 6 years processing other people's finances with a competence that had always felt like it was meant for something larger and had never found its channel. She thought about her father at his desk. The shadows of numbers. The way he had said it, every dollar leaves a shadow, with the quiet certainty of someone who believed that truth was structural, that it existed in the architecture of things and could always be found if you knew how to look. She looked at the folder. She turned to the back pages, past the transfer records, past the subsidiary chains, to the very last section, documents she hadn't reached yet. These were different in character from everything before them, denser, more technical. Pages of what appeared to be internal audit notation in her father's hand, the small, careful script she recognized, running across spreadsheet printouts in blue ink. And then, on the final page, something that stopped her. It was a handwritten note. 1 page, no date. The paper slightly different from everything else, as if it had been inserted after the fact. The handwriting was her father's, but the quality of it was different, more compressed, more hurried, the letters smaller than his usual notation, as if he'd been writing fast or writing in limited space. It began, If you're reading this, something went wrong and they have me. The codes are layered, primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary is personal. You'll know? Secondary is the case number from the Meridian investigation. Find the original filing. Tertiary is the one they can't get from me because I don't have it anymore. She read that last sentence 3 times. Tertiary is the one they can't get from me because I don't have it anymore. She turned the page over. Blank. She went back through the preceding pages, looking for anything she'd missed. Nothing. "Damien," she said. He was across the room. He came to her. She held up the note. He read it. She watched him read it a second time. He set it down. "The tertiary code," she said. "You've read this?" "Yes." "You know what it means?" A pause. Brief enough to be meaningless, long enough to mean everything. "I have a theory," he said. "Stop telling me you have theories and tell me what you know." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. This was new. The sitting. He had been in motion since they left the tower, and the act of sitting carried the weight of something he had decided to stop carrying alone. "Your father built the tertiary code outside his own memory," Damien said. "Something he deposited somewhere before he disappeared. Something he couldn't be coerced into giving up because he genuinely didn't have access to it anymore." "Where?" Lena said. "He gave it to someone," Damien said. "Someone who wouldn't know what they had. Someone they wouldn't think to look at." The room went very quiet. She understood before he finished saying it. The understanding arrived not in her mind, but in her body, a cold, specific recognition that traveled from her sternum outward. "My mother," she said. Damien's expression confirmed it without words. "He gave it to my mother," she said, "before he disappeared." We believe it's embedded in something she would have kept. Documents, objects, something ordinary enough that a decade of surveillance wouldn't flag it. Lena thought about her mother, about what her mother had kept, about the apartment she had cleared after the funeral 3 years ago, sorting through a life with the mechanical efficiency of grief that doesn't have time to be grief, boxing things for donation, keeping only what she could carry, what she had kept, what she was still carrying. "The Bible," she said. The word came out barely above a whisper. Damien went still. "The Bible my mother kept," Lena said. "The one with the debt ledger in it, the number she wrote, every payment." She stopped. "I kept it. It's in my apartment." Her apartment, where she had lived for 6 years at the same address that appeared on every document she'd ever filed, every tax return, every account statement, the address that anyone who had been watching her family for 15 years would have on file. "My apartment," she said again, and this time it wasn't wonder, yes, it was the sound of someone understanding exactly how exposed they are. Nadia spun around from her monitor. "When did you last check your home network activity?" I don't monitor my... Did you access anything from your home address in the last 48 hours? Phone, laptop, anything that would confirm your location before you came to the tower today?" Lena thought about yesterday morning. The alarm clock, the coffee. Checking her email before she left, sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open, the morning routine of someone who had no reason to be careful yet. "Yesterday morning," she said. Nadia turned back to her keyboard and typed something and pulled up a screen that meant nothing to Lena visually, but clearly meant something to Nadia because the expression on her face shifted in a direction that was not good. "There's been active access on your home Wi-Fi network in the last 6 hours," Nadia said. "Someone is in your apartment." The folder, the Bible, the tertiary code that her father had built into the most ordinary object in a grieving woman's home. Trusting that grief was the best camouflage, trusting that nobody would look at a widow's Bible for the key to dismantling an international criminal network. They were in her apartment right now, looking. "We have to go," Lena said, already standing. "If they find it," Marcus started. "They won't know what they're looking at," Lena said, grabbing her coat. "The notation is my mother's handwriting and my father's code. They won't recognize it as anything unless they already know what to look for." She looked at Damien. "But we need it before they decide to take everything and sort it out later." Damien was already moving, but Marcus's phone rang before they reached the door. He looked at the screen, answered it, listened for 11 seconds without speaking. When he lowered the phone, his face had the color of someone whose blood had just made a collective decision to be somewhere else. "What?" Damien said. Marcus looked at Lena, not at Damien, at Lena, which told her that whatever had just come through the phone was specifically about her. "The men who were watching Voss Tower this morning," Marcus said. "We pulled their vehicle registration through Rennie's contact at Motorpool. The plates came back to a licensed security firm." He paused. "The firm's primary contract client, on record, is the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Bureau. The room did the pressure thing again. The air not moving but changing quality. Hartman sent them, Lena said. They weren't network contractors, Marcus said. They were federal, which means Hartman knows she came to you, which means he knows. He knows we have the folder, Damien said. There's more. Marcus looked at his phone, at the screen, set it face up on the table so they could all see it. It was a news alert, 3 minutes old, from a local city outlet. The headline read, "Woman sought for questioning in connection with financial fraud investigation. Federal authorities confirm active search." Below the headline was a photograph. It was Lena's federal ID photo from 6 years ago, slightly low resolution, the kind of image you get when someone pulls a file in a hurry. Her name was printed beneath it. The alert described her as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation into fraudulent financial activities. Hartman hadn't just sent watchers, he had flipped the board entirely. He had made her the criminal. In the span of a morning, he had converted the woman carrying evidence of his corruption into a fugitive whose word meant nothing and whose possession of any documentation would read as the desperate fabrication of someone trying to deflect. Her name was on a federal alert, and the Bible was in her apartment, and somewhere in upstate New York, her father was being moved into a room he would never leave. Lena looked at the news alert on Marcus's phone for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at Damien. "My apartment is 12 minutes from here," she said. "It's being watched." "I know." "Federal surveillance, not network contractors, actual federal assets, which means if we approach that building, I know what it means." She was already moving to the table, pulling the map toward her, orienting herself to the neighborhood grid. Hartman put out the alert 40 minutes ago. Federal surveillance protocol for a person of interest at a residential address. How long before they have eyes on the building? Damien looked at Marcus. 90-minute standard, Marcus said. If they're prioritizing, 60. How long ago was the alert posted? 43 minutes. Then we have 17 minutes before this becomes impossible. She looked up. Who drives? Nobody moved for 2 seconds. Then Marcus said, I drive, and reached for his jacket. Damien caught her arm before she reached the door. Not hard. A contact. A pressure. The physical version of weight. The people already inside your apartment, he said. They won't have found it yet. The ledger is inside the back cover. My mother stitched it in. She pulled her arm free. Not angrily, just deliberately. My father knew exactly who might search that apartment and exactly how they'd search it. He didn't hide the code in the book. He hid it in my mother's handwriting, in the number she wrote every month for 12 years. Nobody looks at a widow's accounting as encryption. Damien held her gaze. Then he said to Marcus, Take the Civic. Nothing registered to us. They went. The Civic was parked 2 blocks from the safe house, an 8-year-old gray sedan with a cracked dashboard and the specific smell of a car that has transported many things its registration doesn't reflect. Marcus drove. Damien rode passenger. Lena was in the back with the folder on the seat beside her and her eyes on the street outside the window, running the approach geometry in her head. Which entrance? Which angle? How long inside? How long back out? Back entrance, she said. Building has a service alley off Merchant Street. There's a code panel, but I know the override. Maintenance told me when I moved in because the front buzzer was broken and they hadn't fixed it yet. Who knows that entrance, Marcus said, but building staff, residents, nobody external unless they've been inside the building operation, which federal surveillance usually doesn't bother with for a standard person of interest flag. She paused. The people already inside, how did they get in? Damien said, lock impressions, most likely. They had your address and enough lead time. It's standard entry. Front door or back? Front. They'd want visibility on the street. Then we go back. She looked at her watch. 14 minutes. Marcus drove like someone who knows the difference between fast and reckless and has made a deliberate choice to live in the space between them. He cut 3 lights and used an alley bypass that took 90 seconds off the route and pulled into the service lane behind Lena's building without announcing the turn. The alley was empty. Service containers, a bicycle locked to a drain pipe, the back wall of the building with its plain metal door and the keypad beside it. 2 minutes inside, Damien said. Maximum. I need 3. 2. She got out of the car. The code was 4 digits and a star key, and her fingers found them without thinking. The body memory of 6 years of carrying groceries through this entrance when the front door felt like too much interaction with neighbors she barely knew. The lock released. She went in. The service corridor smelled like cleaning products and the particular institutional warmth of a building's mechanical core. She took the stairs. Elevator was a closed box with a camera. Up 3 flights, moving as quietly as she could move, which was quiet enough. She had grown up in apartments. She knew how to navigate stairs without making the building talk. 3rd floor. Her door was 12 feet from the stairwell. She stopped before the corner and listened. Voices. Low, one of them, the half-present murmur of someone on a phone call rather than speaking to a person in the room. She couldn't make out words. She heard a drawer close, the sound of someone moving through a space with the efficient disinterest of a professional search. 1 person. Possibly 2, but the acoustic signature of the floor movement suggested 1. She thought about 2 minutes. She thought about the Bible, which was on the shelf above her desk in the main room, 3rd from the left, between a dictionary she'd had since college and a field guide to North American birds that she'd bought at a garage sale and never opened. She came around the corner. Her door was closed but unlocked. She could see the latch position from the gap at the frame. She pushed it open and went in fast, and the man standing at her desk turned around and she had about a quarter second to read him. Mid-30s, plain clothes, the flat professional attention of someone trained to assess threats quickly. Before he said, "Stop, federal?" She threw the folder at his face. Not the whole folder. The loose pages from the back that she'd been holding separately. She'd pulled them in the stairwell without quite consciously deciding to, some part of her brain that was running ahead of the rest. The pages hit him across the eyes and he flinched, which gave her 2 steps, and she was already at the shelf with her hand on the Bible before he had his vision back. "Do not move," he said. His voice had the specific register of someone who is used to that phrase working. Lena turned around with the Bible in her hand. He had a weapon out. Standard federal sidearm, aimed at her center mass. His stance correct and stable. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who has been briefed on a person of interest and is now encountering the actual person and finding the gap between the briefing and reality slightly larger than expected. "I'm a federal agent," he said. "Set it down." "Which division?" she said, a fractional pause. "Treasury Enforcement." "Who's your supervising SAC?" Another pause. Longer. "That's not... If you're legitimate federal, you have a supervising special agent in charge and you can name them," she said. She could hear her own heartbeat now, a very loud and unhelpful sound. "If you can't name them, we both know why you're here and who sent you, and we both know you're not going to pull that trigger in a residential building over a book." The gun didn't waver. But his eyes did just slightly, the micro movement of someone recalculating. She walked to the door. He said, "Stop!" Again, and she didn't. And he didn't pull the trigger, and she went through the door and back down the hall and into the stairwell at a pace that was not quite running because running is a sound, and she needed to be quiet for 12 more seconds. Down the stairs. Through the service corridor, out the back door into the alley where Marcus had the Civic idling, and Damien was standing outside the passenger door with his eyes on the alley entrance. She got in. Marcus moved before the door was fully closed. "One inside," she said, breathing harder than she wanted to. "Hartman's asset, not legitimate federal. Couldn't name his SAC." "You walked past a drawn weapon," Damien said. He was looking at the Bible in her hands. "He wasn't going to shoot me." "You didn't know that." "I assessed it. In about 4 seconds." "Was I wrong?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Marcus had them back on a main artery within 90 seconds, moving with traffic, the Civic indistinguishable from the ordinary river of city vehicles. Lena sat in the back with the Bible in her lap and her hands still steady, which surprised her again. The steadiness, the way her body had decided to be useful in a crisis instead of honest about how frightened it was. She opened the Bible to the back cover. The stitching was her mother's, small, even. The neat cross-stitch of a woman who had learned to sew as a child and never stopped doing it well. Lena had noticed it years ago and thought nothing of it. had assumed it was a repair, the cover coming loose from the spine and her mother fixing it the way she fixed everything, quietly and without asking anyone for help. She worked her thumbnail along the inner edge of the stitching. The thread was old, but her mother had used good thread, and it took longer than 2 minutes. Damien watched her from the front seat and said nothing. The stitching gave. Inside the back cover, her mother had sewn a single folded piece of paper into a flat pocket she'd created between the cover board and the lining. The paper was thin, the fold tight, the whole thing no thicker than 3 sheets of paper stacked, invisible to any search that wasn't specifically looking for a hidden compartment in a book cover. Lena unfolded it. It was her father's handwriting again, but different this time from the hurried note at the back of the folder. This was careful, considered. The handwriting of someone who knew this message had to survive indefinitely and be understood perfectly. At the top, for Lena. If your mother is gone, I'm sorry. If she's still with you, give her my love and don't tell her what this is. She stopped reading for a moment, pressed her lips together, kept going. Below that, a string of characters, some numbers, letters, symbols, 43 characters in a sequence that meant nothing to her literally, but that she understood, even without the encryption context, to be the tertiary access code. Below the string, a single explanatory sentence. Your 7th birthday. The cake was wrong and you didn't cry. She remembered. Yellow cake with white frosting, which was what she had asked for, except the bakery had made chocolate, and her father had held it together all the way through the candles and the song and waited until she had her first bite to watch her face, and she had eaten the whole piece and told him it was perfect, and he had known it wasn't what she wanted, and she had known that he knew, and neither of them had said anything because they were the same kind of person, the kind that absorbs disappointment without putting it on other people. He had built the key from that moment, from the specific quality of a 7-year-old's grace. She folded the paper, put it in her interior coat pocket against her ribs. I have it, she said. Marcus drove. Damien said, all 3 layers. Yes. Then we can move on the estate. We can move on the estate. He turned to face forward. She saw him exhale. Not with relief, because this wasn't the kind of situation that produced relief, but with the specific release of a man who has been holding a plan at arm's length for 18 months and can finally let it get close. They were back at the safe house within 20 minutes. Nadia met them at the door. 7 is confirmed, Nadia said. Marcus's contact came through on the 8th. We have 8. Equipment, Damien said. Vans loaded, 2 vehicles. Timeline. Leave in 90 minutes. We hit the estate at the edge of the evening window. Low light, residential property. Their guard rotation is most likely structured for nighttime primary. If we move at dusk, we catch the transition. You have the rotation read, Damien said. I have a rotation estimate based on the satellite thermal. Nadia's voice carried the weight of someone who knows the difference between data and certainty and is tired of people not appreciating that gap. It's not a confirmed read. How confident? 70%. That's the number we work with. Damien moved to the equipment table. Lena, she looked at him. You're not tactical, he said. It wasn't an insult. You're not trained for a forced entry operation, and I can't make you trained in 90 minutes. What I can do is put you in a position where you're useful at the critical moment and protected until then. He held her gaze. That means you follow Marcus from the moment we breach until the moment we have your father. Exactly. No deviation. She thought about arguing, thought about the federal agent in her apartment, and the 4 seconds she'd used to read a situation that could have gone very differently. Agreed, she said. Say it like you mean it. I mean it, she said. Marcus, every step. Until we have him. Damien nodded once. The 90 minutes went fast and slow, in the uneven way that waiting goes when the thing you're waiting for is large enough to reorganize everything that comes after. Lena studied the estate layout that Nadia had assembled from satellite composites and county property records. A main house, large, Georgian style, 3 floors, with 2 secondary structures on the property, one confirmed as a groundskeeping facility, and one whose function the property records listed as a storage building, but whose thermal imaging suggested internal temperature regulation inconsistent with storage. The second structure, climate-controlled, consistent with occupied interior space. That was where he was. She looked at the thermal image for a long time. The warm signature of a human body in a controlled environment, 8 people in the main house, 3 in the secondary structures, 1 signature in the small building that was not a storage facility. 1 signature. Alone. 12 years. Nadia drove 1 vehicle. Marcus drove the other, and Lena rode with Marcus and 2 men she'd been introduced to only by first names, Cal, who was compact and spoke in 3-word sentences, and a man named Briggs who was older, maybe 50, with a calmness that was different from Damien's calmness, more weathered, the serenity of someone who has been in enough bad situations to stop catastrophizing about them in advance. Damien rode in Nadia's vehicle, separate, tactical, the way a commander separates from his primary asset before an operation, so that if the asset is lost, the command function continues. She understood that. She didn't like it. They drove north. The estate road was unpaved for the last mile, running through secondary growth trees that were gaining their October color, the dying light palette of red and amber and the specific tired gold of late afternoon in the northeast. The vehicles stopped at the tree line, 400 meters from the estate perimeter. From here, the main house was visible above the tree screen. Lit windows, the blue-white of interior lighting against the failing outdoor light. The secondary building was dark from this angle, but she knew from the thermal composite where it was. 200 meters to the right of the main house. She could see the roofline. They moved on foot through the trees. 8 people, moving with the disciplined near silence of a group that has practiced this kind of approach. The footfalls controlled, the spacing tactical. Lena moved in the center formation with Marcus 2 steps ahead and Briggs at her right, and she focused on matching their foot placement, stepping where they stepped, learning the rhythm of it. The tree cover ended at a low stone wall that demarcated the estate's formal boundary. Damien crouched at the wall, looked at his watch, made a hand signal she was learning to read. 30 seconds. She counted. Cal went over the wall first, then Briggs. Then Marcus pulled her by the elbow, and she went over in a scrambling movement that was not graceful, and she didn't care about graceful. And then they were on estate ground with the grass under their feet and the main house windows 30 meters to the left and the secondary building 200 meters ahead, its dark profile against the darkening sky, and her father inside it after 12 years in a room with no windows, and the motion sensor light above the secondary building's door came on. All at once. Bright white halogen, the flat, merciless light of detection. Damien said, "Go!" And the formation accelerated from controlled movement to something faster and louder and committed. And somewhere in the main house a door opened and the estate went from quiet to not quiet in the space of 4 running steps, and Lena ran with Marcus's hand on her arm, ran toward the lit building with her heart doing something extraordinary in her chest, ran through the white light toward the door where her father was behind it. And everything that came before and after this moment was going to be defined by the next. 30 feet from the door and the estate erupted. The main house disgorged 4 men through the side entrance, moving fast, not the measured response of security personnel executing a protocol, but the urgent scramble of people who had been caught in the middle of something and were now improvising. Cal peeled left to intercept them. Damien's voice came through the earpiece Marcus had given Lena in the vehicle. 2 words, clipped and absolute. "Keep moving." Marcus kept moving. The secondary building's door was metal, institutional, wrong for a residential estate, and right for everything it actually was. There was a keypad. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled a small device from his jacket, pressed it against the panel, and in 4 seconds the lock released with a sound like an exhaled breath. Behind them, the estate had become noise. Shouting, the percussion of a physical confrontation somewhere in the dark, a single sharp impact that could have been anything. Lena didn't look back. She had agreed to Marcus every step, and she was keeping that agreement with every piece of discipline she had, which was more than she'd known she possessed before tonight. Inside. A corridor. Concrete floor, fluorescent tubes overhead, the same institutional lighting as the maintenance corridor in Voss Tower, except grimier, less maintained, the light of a place that nobody expected to impress. 4 doors on the left side, 1 at the end. Marcus moved to the end door first. "Ashcroft," he said, his voice low and direct. "Thomas Ashcroft." Silence for 2 seconds. Then from behind the door, a sound. Not words. The sound a person makes when they have been in a room alone for a very long time and have nearly stopped expecting sounds from outside it to mean anything. Marcus looked at the door. Standard key lock, older than the front panel. He stepped back and put his shoulder into it twice, and on the second impact the frame gave and the door opened inward. The room was small, 8 feet by 10 maybe. A cot along one wall, a metal table bolted to the floor, a single fluorescent tube in the ceiling behind a wire cage, a drain in the floor. A man sitting on the edge of the cot with his hands on his knees and his head up, looking at the door with the specific expression of someone who has learned not to react to things until they confirm themselves real. He was older. She had known he would be older, but the knowing had not prepared her for the reality of it. The white hair, the deep-set lines around his eyes, the way he held his body with the careful economy of someone managing chronic pain. The scar along his right temple had healed badly, a ridge of tissue that pulled slightly at the corner of his eye, but his hands were on his knees exactly the way she remembered. "Dad," Lena said. Thomas Ashcroft looked at his daughter standing in a broken doorway in a building he had been told he would never leave, and something moved across his face that had no name in any language she knew, some combination of relief and grief and the particular agony of a joy that has been deferred so long it arrives already mixed with loss. He stood up. Slowly, the way the body moves when it has forgotten what urgency feels like. She crossed the room and put her arms around him and felt how thin he was, the shoulder blades sharp through the gray jumpsuit, and she pressed her face against his neck and smelled the institutional smell of him, soap and concrete, and the particular flatness of recycled air, and held him with her whole strength, and did not cry, could not cry. Her body was still in operational mode, and crying wasn't available yet. He held her back. "Lena," he said, just her name, the way he used to say it when she was small and had done something that frightened him, the specific intonation of a parent who has confronted the reality of how much they stand to lose. "We have to go," Marcus said from the doorway. "Right now." She pulled back, kept her hands on her father's arms, looked at his face. "Can you walk?" "Yes." His voice was rougher than she remembered. 12 years of limited use. "I can walk." She put her arm through his, and they went. The corridor was still clear. Behind them and above them and in the direction of the main house, the estate was still generating noise, but the quality of it had changed. Less chaotic, more directed, the sound of a confrontation finding its shape. Marcus moved them fast through the corridor and back into the outside air, and Thomas Ashcroft took his first breath of outside air in however long it had been since they'd moved him from Pennsylvania, and she felt the way it hit him, the chest expansion, the slight stagger, the body relearning what uncontrolled air felt like. "Keep moving," she said, and he did. Briggs materialized from the shadow of the estate wall with his arm already extended, taking Thomas's other side, and the three of them moved across the grass toward the tree line. Behind them, Lena heard Damien's voice, not in the earpiece, actually heard it, raised in a way she had not heard it before. The specific register of a man giving a final instruction in a situation where final means what it says. She looked back. She shouldn't have. Marcus had told her not to. But she looked. Damien was standing 20 meters behind them near the corner of the main house, and he was facing a man she hadn't seen before, taller than Damien, older, wearing a dark overcoat that was wrong for the location. The same way everything about this estate was wrong for what it appeared to be on paper. The man had the bearing of someone who does not expect to be in physical spaces himself, who expects spaces to be managed for him, and the fact that he was standing in the grass of his estate in the dark, while it was being breached, was clearly not a situation he had planned for. Gerald Hartman looked exactly like his federal personnel photograph, older, softer around the jaw, but the careful eyes were the same, the eyes of someone who has spent decades reading rooms and adjusting. He was trying to adjust now, and it wasn't working. "Move," Briggs said in her ear, and she moved. The trees came up around them, and the darkness of the tree cover was total for a moment before her eyes adjusted and she could hear her father's breathing beside her, the slightly labored rhythm of a man moving faster than his body had been asked to move in a long time. And she matched her pace to his without thinking about it, the way you adjust to someone you know. At the vehicles, Nadia had both engines running. Lena got her father into the back seat of the first vehicle and got in beside him, and Nadia drove before the door had fully closed. Through the rear window, Lena watched the estate fall behind. The lit windows of the main house visible through the trees, the secondary building dark. Thomas sat beside her and looked at his hands in his lap. "How long?" he said. "Since the Pennsylvania facility? Since last night." "No." He looked up. "How long total?" She held his gaze. 12 years. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, the slight movement at the corner of his jaw, the breath he took through his nose and released slowly. 12 years rendered into 2 words and a silence because there was no other way to render it. "Your mother," he said. Lena looked at his hands. 3 years ago. He nodded. Once. The nod of someone filing away a grief that they will not process in a moving vehicle in front of people they don't know, that they will carry to somewhere private and set down correctly. She recognized it because she had done the same thing at her mother's funeral, the same controlled storage of something too large for the available space. "She believed the debt," Lena said, "until the end. She thought you borrowed it." "I know." His voice was flat. Not cold, emptied out. "I knew they'd do something like that. I didn't know the specific shape of it. She paid it, every month, for years." Lena paused. "And then I took over." Thomas looked at her face for a long moment with the expression of a man calculating a debt of his own, the kind that isn't in any ledger. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know." "Lena, I know," she said again, not cutting him off, receiving it. "We'll talk. There's time now to talk, but not right now." He nodded, looked back at his hands. Outside the window, the upstate darkness moved past, the trees giving way to the first lights of a town. Ordinary life doing its ordinary thing on a weeknight. People in lit windows, a gas station, a dog on a leash. Thomas Ashcroft watched it like a man relearning a language. They drove south for 40 minutes before Nadia pulled off at a secondary location. A motel on a state highway, the kind of place that takes cash without discussion, registered under a name that traced to nothing. 2 rooms. Marcus and Briggs took one. Lena and her father took the other. Nadia sat in the car in the parking lot with her laptop and kept working. Damien arrived 22 minutes after them. He came in through the side entrance of the motel parking lot on foot, his jacket torn at the left shoulder seam, dried blood along the side of his jaw from something that had caught him above the ear. He walked with the controlled evenness of someone managing pain with the same focus they'd apply to any other tactical problem. Lena met him in the parking lot. She looked at the blood. "Hartman." He had a man with him that we hadn't read in the surveillance. Damien touched the side of his jaw with 2 fingers, assessed it, moved on. "It's handled." Handled means, "Hartman is in federal custody." He said it without drama. "There's a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, not Treasury, separate chain, that I've been cultivating for 2 years against the possibility of this moment. Nadia made the call 40 minutes ago with the first document package from your father's folder. Hartman was apprehended at the estate before he could reach his vehicle." Lena stood in the parking lot with the highway noise behind her and thought about the careful voice on the phone. 22-year-old Lena calling a federal number after her father's reported death and speaking to a man who had known, who had been one of the architects of everything that followed. "The network," she said. The document package Nadia transmitted includes the transfer records, the subsidiary chain documentation, and the Meridian case files. The FBI contact is working with 2 international partners. The package is already in 3 separate jurisdictions. He looked at her steadily. "It doesn't end tonight. These things don't end in one night. But the door is open, and it's open from the inside, which means they can't close it." She thought about her father's words in the note. "Every dollar leaves a shadow. If you know how to read shadows, you can find anything." "The access codes," she said, "the encrypted ledgers. Your father will need to transmit the codes to the FBI contact directly. It'll take time to do it safely through channels that can't be intercepted." He paused. "He understands that?" "He understands more about this than either of us," she said. A silence. "Damien." She said his name the way she hadn't said it before, without the edge that had been in it every other time. Just the name. Cal. What happened to Cal? A fractional pause. The scar along his jaw went pale. He's alive, Damien said. Took a hit to the shoulder. Marcus got him out. He looked at the pavement between them. He knew what the job was. That's not an answer to what I asked. No, he said. It's not. She looked at the blood on his face, thought about 18 months of preparation, 12 years of carrying a file he hadn't known what to do with, every call he couldn't make and every option that closed on him. You could have given the file to someone years ago, she said. Some channel I don't know about. You could have ended this without me. No, he said. I couldn't. Why? Because the tertiary code was in your mother's Bible, he said. Because your father built the final key around a moment that only his daughter would recognize. The file without the codes is a story. With the codes, it's evidence. He looked at her directly. The quality of his gaze the same as it had been in the tower. No performance, no management, just the fact. He built it so that it required you. I don't know if he foresaw exactly this, but he built it so that his family would have to be part of closing it. So it couldn't be done around you. Lena thought about yellow cake and white frosting and a 7-year-old who absorbed disappointment without putting it on other people. Her father hadn't just hidden a code. He had made a promise that whoever came for the truth would have to bring his daughter, that the ending would require her, that she would not be a bystander to her own story. She went back inside. Her father was sitting at the small table in the motel room with a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was looking at nothing, the particular orientation of someone reviewing interior footage, running back through years of accumulated interior experience with the measured attention of a man who has had nothing but time to think and now has something to actually do with the thoughts. She sat across from him. She put the piece of paper on the table between them, the one from the Bible, the code, and beneath it, your 7th birthday. The cake was wrong and you didn't cry. He looked at it for a long time. He picked it up. He read it twice, and the quality of his face when he set it back down was different. Not lighter exactly, but reorganized. The way a room looks different after someone opens the windows even if the furniture hasn't moved. You remembered, he said. It was a good cake, she said. Something crossed his face that was close to a smile, close enough that she recognized its shape, even through 12 years of everything that had happened to it. It was chocolate, he said. I like chocolate, she said. You asked for yellow. I was wrong about what I wanted. He looked at her across the table. This man who had built a case around the specific grace of his daughter, who had trusted that she would find it, who had kept codes in his head for 12 years in a room with no windows because he believed, had to have believed, to survive it, that there was a version of events where the door opened and she was on the other side of it. The codes, she said. When you're ready. I'm ready now. The FBI contact. I know the protocols. I built some of them. He looked at his hands, turned them over. The hands of a man who had spent 12 years doing very little with them. Give me a phone and a secure line and I'll have the access architecture transmitted within the hour. She went to the door, called to Nadia. The transmission took 48 minutes. Her father sat at this table with Nadia's secure laptop and worked with the focused efficiency of someone for whom this kind of concentration was the most natural thing in the world. The posture returning, the certainty in his hands as they moved across the keyboard, the years in the room falling away from him in layers as the work brought him back to himself. Lena sat on the edge of the bed and watched him work and thought about her mother's handwriting in the margins of the debt ledger. All those careful numbers, all those years of accounting for a wrong that wasn't real. She thought about the apartment she would go back to and the job she would probably not go back to, and the version of herself that had walked into Voss Tower that morning with $43,800 and the expectation of a clean ending. Clean endings, she was learning, were not the kind that meant anything. The ones that meant something were the ones that cost something, the ones where the price was visible and you paid it anyway. When her father finished, he closed the laptop and sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent light in the motel room was not kind to him, showed every year, every cost. But his eyes, when he lowered them and found her face, were the same eyes she remembered. The eyes of a man who looked at everything the way you look at a problem you believe can be solved. "Tell me about her," he said. "Your mother. Tell me what she was like at the end." She told him. She talked for a long time, and he listened without interrupting, which was his way. It had always been his way. The complete and unhurried attention of a person who understood that listening was its own form of work and took it seriously. She told him about the last years, the apartment, the garden plot her mother had kept in the community space behind the building, the way she had continued to cook elaborate Sunday meals for 2 people even after Lena had moved across the city, how she had set a third place at the table sometimes and not explained it. She told him about the careful numbers in the margins of the book she'd kept. Thomas listened to that part with his eyes on his hands and his jaw tight, and when she finished, he nodded the same way he had nodded in the car, the careful storage of something too large for now, and said, "She was stronger than both of us." "I know," Lena said. Outside, the highway moved its ordinary traffic through the dark. Somewhere in the building, Cal was in a bed with his shoulder wrapped and his operational career probably over, and Marcus sitting in a chair beside him not saying anything, because Marcus was the kind of man who understood that presence was sometimes the whole thing. Nadia was in the parking lot dismantling digital traces with the same focus she'd applied to building them. Damien was... She didn't know where Damien was. She found him outside 40 minutes later, when her father had finally fallen asleep in the motel bed with the exhausted totality of a body that has been waiting for permission for a very long time. Damien was standing at the far edge of the parking lot where the light from the motel sign didn't reach, looking at the highway. He had cleaned the blood from his face. His jacket was folded over his arm. She stood beside him. "What happens to you now?" she said. "That depends on what the FBI does with the subsidiary chain documentation," he said. "My connection to the Meridian network is in there. Peripheral, 12 years old, technically time-barred in most jurisdictions. But it's there." "You knew it would be." "Yes." "You gave Nadia the documents knowing your name was in them." "Yes." She thought about that for a moment, about the specific quality of a decision made before the consequences are survivable, before you know which way it lands. "The Empire," she said. "What you said in the safe house. You'd been dismantling it." 18 months, he said. "I've been moving the organization toward legitimate operations since I decided to move on this. It's not clean. It's not fast. Some of it never will be." He looked at the highway. "But it's less than it was." "Is that enough?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "It's not enough. It's what's possible." He turned slightly and looked at her profile. "That's the most honest thing I can tell you about it." She stood with that. The highway noise was a constant underneath everything else. The movement of ordinary people going ordinary places on an ordinary night, all of it continuing without reference to the cost of the last 24 hours, which seemed right and also slightly unbearable. "My father built a key around the idea that I would come," she said, "that I would be the one who finished it." She paused. He had 12 years to think about that, to decide that was the right call. Was it? She thought about the envelope she'd brought to Voss Tower that morning. $43,800. The weight of 15 years. The expectation that paying it would create an ending. The ending it had actually created was nothing like what she'd expected. It was larger and worse, and in some specific way she hadn't located the language for yet. More completely hers. Every debt collected, every shadow read, every hidden thing brought into light that made the light itself feel different. "Yes," she said. It was the right call. She went back inside. 3 weeks later, the first federal indictments were unsealed. 17 names across 4 countries. 6 of them held political positions. 2 held banking licenses. 3 were officers of corporations whose names appeared on the kind of television advertisements that made you feel like the company was old enough to be trustworthy. Gerald Hartman was the 4th name on the list. Lena read the indictment from her father's kitchen table. He had been placed in a federal protection arrangement pending the full scope of the prosecution, a suite of rooms in a building she wasn't allowed to name even in private, which she found both reasonable and irritating. They had breakfast together every Sunday through a secure visitation arrangement that smelled like federal waiting rooms and coffee from a machine that had never learned how. He was teaching her his notation system, the shadow reading, the way numbers revealed themselves to a person who knew where to look. She came to the Sunday sessions with questions she had worked through during the week, approaching the ledgers the way she'd watched him approach everything, methodically, without impatience, trusting that the structure would reveal itself if she was willing to look at it long enough. It was not the kind of accounting she had done for 6 years at the firm. It was harder and quieter, and it felt like the right size for her. She kept the Bible on her desk at the place she was renting. The stitching was still open along the back cover where she'd worked her thumbnail through her mother's careful cross-stitch. She hadn't resewn it. She wasn't sure she would. It seemed important to leave visible the place where the hidden thing had been, not as damage, but as record. Evidence that something had been kept here, and kept faithfully, and finally given to the person who needed it. Damien's name appeared in the indictment documentation as a cooperating witness. She read that once and set the papers down. She hadn't spoken to him since the parking lot of the Highway Motel. She didn't know if she would. There was no clean category for what he was to her. Not gratitude, not trust, not the simple, uncomplicated opposite of those things either. Something more complicated and less resolved that she suspected would remain complicated and unresolved for a long time, which seemed honest, which seemed like the right shape for it. The last envelope of money was still in her coat pocket. She had never reclaimed it from Damien's desk. One afternoon, she deposited it into the account she was building. Not for debt, not against anything, just for what came next. The first deposit toward a future that belonged to her in the way nothing had belonged to her since before her father disappeared, since before the careful numbers in the margins, since before she'd learned to organize her life around what she owed instead of what she wanted. $43,800. The balance in the account entered and confirmed, the cursor blinking in the ordinary afternoon light of a life that was no longer defined by what it owed. She closed the laptop. Outside, the city was doing its ordinary thing, indifferent and continuous and completely unaware of the specific weight of the morning, which was fine. The city didn't need to know. It was enough that she knew, and her father knew, and somewhere in whatever remained of Damien Voss's diminishing empire, one man knew the specific accounting of what 12 years of keeping faith actually cost, and had decided, for reasons of his own, that it had been worth the price. She put on her coat, walked out into it.